Well, folks, I'm not going to tell you who the realtor is, but episode 26 starts off with a realtor nonchalantly admitting to a client that they have no problem breaking rules and it's just part of the daily routine. So what started this whole deal off was the buyer made an offer on this property through this realtor and then instructed the realtor that I would be doing the inspection. The realtor responded back to the client by stating, "I would prefer if you didn't work with Mark, but I'm not supposed to say that." So at this point in the deal, ladies and gentlemen, the buyer still didn't really understand what was going on, why the realtor was so dead set on steering them away from my service. However, the buyer stood tall and ended up getting me to do this inspection. And when I did it, I encountered a major defect, and that caused the buyer to end up walking away later on in the deal. However, it was the way I found this major defect that really impressed this client. And that is when they actually put two and two together, that realtors, a lot of realtors have a desire to steer you away from certain inspectors and steer you towards inspectors that they approve of to increase their chances of selling the property or the home. Now, we're going to head back to the office here. I'm going to show you guys what I found and how I found it and what it caused the buyer to do at the end of the deal. Okay, so what did I find and how did I find it? Well, after inspecting the roof and the exterior on this home, I made my way into the basement like I normally do to inspect the foundation and inspect for moisture and that kind of stuff. And while I was in this basement, I was looking around and everything was covered in drywall, literally everything. And I'm going to pop up an image here. This here is a wood beam and wood column from a friend's house, very similar to the wood beam and column that was in the home that I was inspecting. However, every square inch or centimeter of this wood beam and wood column was drywalled, taped, and mudded. Now, I'm not just talking about in the living room in the basement. I'm standing in this mechanical room. You know, a mechanical room is usually for the furnace, the water heater, the washer, the dryer, and typically used for storage. People don't beautify this area. However, I'm standing in this mechanical room and I'm looking at this beam in this column and it is completely drywalled, taped, and mudded. And I'm standing there looking at it going, people don't do this. People don't normally beautify their mechanical rooms to this extent. Something's going on here. And, you know, as I'm looking around, like I said, this whole basement is concealed. You can't see the foundation, you can't see the wood beam, the wood columns, can't see the floor joists. However, as I'm looking around, because I have suspicions that they're hiding something, I noticed that there was this small little 3/8 gap between the drywall and the ceiling where the furnace return air ductwork, it goes vertical and then it transitions like this to horizontal. So the drywall on this transition on the ductwork came here and there was just this little 3/8 inch gap. That was it. And I grabbed my flashlight out of my pocket and I stuck it up in that gap. And look what I found, ladies and gentlemen, structure fire. So I was able to actually get my camera in there enough that the flash would light up the area. And I was able to even get a photo for the report. And that is what impressed the client in this situation so much, because they literally, when I divulged this defect to them, they literally said, well, how did you find that? The realtor and I spent, you know, a lot of time in this house because of the number of defects that they could actually physically see themselves. We spent a pile of time in there and we couldn't find that. And I said, well, you know, it's just part of, you know, being a home inspector. You got to use that sort of that detective mindset and you have to kind of think how people, you know, act and conduct themselves. And I said, that's basically how I found it. I mean, I looked at a situation that was very unusual and it caused me to investigate things a little bit further. And sure enough, obviously I found this, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what impressed them so much. And that's what actually caused them, like I said earlier, to look at this situation and say, well, this realtor, you know, was clearly trying to steer me away from Mark because this is the kind of stuff that he finds for his clients. Okay, so what did this all cause? Well, at the end of the day, after this defect was divulged to not only my client, but also the realtor, they came back and the seller had said something to the effect of, well, the house hasn't been on fire since I've lived here. And I had to get involved and I had to explain to my client that we don't care that the house hasn't been on fire since you've lived there. All we care is that you own a house that has been on fire at some point and you are trying to sell it to us. I had to actually explain that to my client. Not a very, you know, somebody that's not very well versed in real estate, and that's fine. And that's what I'm there for. I'm there to help protect people in these situations. Really, the realtor should have stepped up to the plate and should have just told the seller, yeah, we don't care that it hasn't been on fire. But again, the realtor is going to use just about anything they can to try and get the buyer to spend their money. the end of the day, obviously my client's going to get the right recommendation in this situation. I made sure that they got the recommendation to seek the advice of a structural engineer. In these situations with structure fires or major defects in structural engineers, a lot of people are just going to walk away instead of spending the money on an engineer, because engineers are about $400 an hour, and you don't know what they're going to say, right? You could spend a pile more money and they could come back with just terrible news, like you got to rip the house off, or you got to rip the roof off, or you know what I mean? It could be really bad news. So a lot of people just end up walking away, and my client ended up doing that in this situation, just decided to move on. But on top of that, because this realtor at the start of this deal acted so corruptly in trying to steer this client away from me, the client ended up turfing this realtor as well and moved on to a different one and made an offer a couple weeks later on a different house, and I inspected that one, and they ended up closing on that house and acquiring that property. I always look back at these situations and I get a chuckle out of realtors doing this. Smart people, generally speaking, are going to turf these individuals and move on to somebody else. And so I always look at it and say, this doesn't make any sense. Why do this to yourself? I know why they do it. They're always trying to make their commission and move on to the next one, and then they don't really care at the end of the day. But I always get a kick out of that. Okay, so what can we learn from episode 26? This is obviously always the most important part of these episodes that I'm putting together for you guys, is that we learn something from this so that the real estate industry and its corruption cannot do this kind of stuff to you guys in the future. So first and foremost, something we've talked about a lot throughout this series is that a lot of realtors will try and get you to work with their preferred inspector, and we all know why that is. We've covered that extensively throughout this series. Number two, if you guys see something inside a home and you're doing your showings with your realtor that just does not look right or is unusual or strange to you, investigate it further. I think we've learned here today that because of my abilities to be that real estate detective or property detective, I looked at a situation that I had never seen before as a home inspector, and it caused me to investigate a situation a little bit harder, and I found a major defect because of it. So if you guys are out there during your showings and you see something that you've never seen before, you see something strange, investigate it. If you don't find out why, then make sure you divulge that to your home inspector so he or she can investigate that further when they do the inspection. And lastly, something we've touched on a number of times as well, ladies and gentlemen, a home inspector cannot sign off on a structure fire. The only professional that can do that is a structural engineer. And so if you encounter a structure fire inside of a home or a commercial property, ensure you are getting a structural engineer to assess it. Do not take the home inspector's word on that. If you guys remember all the way back in episode 3, I believe it was, that elderly gentleman named Mike had a home inspector who was actually a friend of his. That's pretty crazy, isn't it? A friend of his that inspected that home for him and determined that there had been a structure fire in that attic, and that home inspector told him that there was lots of meat left when he did not possess the accreditation to make that assessment. And now Mike is stuck with that house. So again, structural engineers are the only individuals that can sign off on a structure fire. Hope you guys really enjoyed episode 26. It's been quite some time since I pumped out an episode. I've been actually quite busy with some personal stuff. But we are going to definitely get back into a number of episodes. The next 3 or 4 are going to be some text messages from some former clients, as well as some people who wanted to be a client of mine but were steered away. I'm going to show you guys some of the defamation of character and slander that I've endured. As I said, hope you guys enjoyed episode 26. As always, knowledge is power, and we'll see you on the next one.